it, so we could not put it in.
There was not enough room. There was not enough room on that postcard.
And we all worked for another hour and 20 minutes, and we had only got another 100 minutes to read it.
But Bill, think of that. They were smart to start with the short one.
Yeah.
Good night,
Thank you, Joe.
guys. Yeah.
All right, part two. So Carl started with the budget and economic outlook. This is the main CBO report that they do every year. And you can all read it. It is free on the CBO website. It's probably the best single report that comes out each year. So Carl covered the budget deficit highlights, and then I'll get into the economic forecast. And they also did a chapter on trade, so we can catch up on exactly what's going on with China and the tariffs and all that stuff. They sort of pulled it all together in one place. So we'll hit that, and then we'll do a State of the Union fact check. President Trump was just machine gunning one lie after another and one misrepresentation after another. There were some awesome fact checks of that, and we've got a video of one of them that we'll share that's a couple minutes long. It's rather amusing. But the factcheck.org and then PolitiFact both did excellent fact checks, as they usually do, of the Trump claims. And they did sort of general reviews of the entire State of the Union, but they also picked individual lies that they liked better and did their own little thing on that. I think you understand that one of the big strategies Trump is going to use is going to be the economy turned around on a dime because of me argument, all right? And I'm going to attack that one directly, and I think everybody that's a Democrat should know how to attack that argument. Carl's given you a whole bunch of information that you can use. I love the jobs chart for that example, just to say that by May of 2014, we were in record territory for jobs and have been setting records every month since then. And that trajectory actually slowed after Trump came in. So to say that the economy turned around on a dime because of Trump, that's like a great exhibit to use. Because a lot of other variables in the economy look like that. They follow that. GDP kind of looks like that. There's a bunch of them that follow that. So here is a summary of the Congressional Budget Office forecast. I've got a lot of text here. You'll see a lot of slides, a lot of graphics coming up, but pretty much 2.2% growth in 2020. They measure a little differently, fourth quarter to fourth quarter, so it's a little higher, but still than the Federal Reserve forecast that was shown earlier. It's expected to drop down to about 1.7 over the next decade. There's some other details in there, but their general view is that the strong labor market is going to keep unemployment very low. When I show you the unemployment slide, you're going to be shocked. They're looking at 3.5% unemployment for 3 or 4 more years. I mean, that's phenomenally low unemployment. So this idea, is there a much risk of recession? I'm with Carl on that. Not much, unless something really unusual happens, like this coronavirus really gets nasty and shuts down China. Then you've got a serious, risk out there. But I don't see anything else out there beside that would likely cause a recession. But one nice thing about what the Congressional Budget Office does is they explain how all these variables tie together. So I'll get into some of that. Here are just a summary of the different variables. And they go over many years, and then they group them at the right-hand side, 23, 24, and then 25 to 30. You can see the rates, but eventually GDP gets back to that 1.6, 1.7 number. That's what they consider to be a sustainable GDP growth rate. If you want to get to 2% growth, or as Trump was saying, 4 to 6% growth, then the only way you're going to do that is massive deficit increases, massive stimulus. And probably a lot of help from the Federal Reserve. Yep.
China was running 8% for quite a while, from 2000 to probably 2015. Were they using that much stimulus?
I don't think so. I don't know, to be honest, the history of Chinese growth. I think their economy was entirely different than ours and how they do it. I mean,
up that technological slope.
Their whole middle class.
Transforming the productivity of the worker.
That's right. They actually, you're right, they moved people from the rural areas into factories. They built entire cities, so there was a lot of stimulus, obviously. But how they kept that growth at that level for that long, I really don't know how they did it. I really don't. There is some doubt about their numbers, but I'm not sure that their numbers are wrong. I just think they...
2 points off their number. I ordered from China. It's from a startup, an Indiegogo startup.
Okay.
And I got a notice that it was supposed to ship, but they can't go back to work yet.
Yeah.
Because the factories in central China, they can't go back to work. So,
Yeah.
it'll be March 1st before they can go back, so they lost the second month, because they did January
Right.
and off. Now they've lost the second month.
Yeah.
That's a big chunk, and it's a big chunk of the budget.
Apple just announced today, I just saw the notice come through, Apple announced that they're gonna be reducing their revenue forecast. They're not sure how much. It is, there's a lot more going on than we know right now. We don't have the data on how much of a disruption we've seen in China yet.
Just with regard to how you could have gotten that 4% growth that all the Republican candidates were predicting back in 2015, 2016.
Yeah.
Open borders.
Get 7 million more workers to fill those jobs, right? Yeah, immigration is another way to get growth, that they sort of shot themselves in the foot by shutting that avenue down.
Yeah.
Yep. So this is kind of how, let me go to this chart for a minute, because this one is one of those very fundamental ideas that are behind a lot of the analysis that different economists use. And I think this is a pretty good example. There's another one coming up here on the unemployment rate. What the Congressional Budget Office says is because of your labor force growth, you're only going to be able to grow so much. These are GDP growth rates, and this goes back a long way, all the way back to 1950. So you've got the first, the left-hand bar chart is 1950 to 73. So that's all obviously historical data, and then as you come up to the present, you've got some forecast information there. But what they're saying is that the labor force is going to contribute a certain amount, and then also productivity is going to contribute a certain amount. And they're saying the sustainable rate is somewhere between that, coming up here, 2020 to 2024 is 2%. And then from 2025 to 2030, it's about 1.7 as that labor force growth slows even more. Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Are these year groupings the way the CBO did it?
This is their chart. All these are their charts.
Because when I looked at this chart, I said, whoever did this really tried to make the Republicans look good and the Democrats look bad.
By grouping them in the years that they used to group their asymmetrical groupings by year.
Well,
Yep.
wait, for instance, let's take that 74 to 81. We include the deep recession of 74, 75 under Ford. And then we pick up the recession in 81 under Reagan,
Yep.
and those look like the Carter years. And then we get Reagan, we take him out of recession, and then the Reagan push to 90, but then we exclude the 91 recession, and we take the Clinton years all the way to 2001, and that Bush recession.
Yeah, I wonder why they did these different buckets or all these different shapes. I don't know why.
And then Bush ends in 2007 before the Great Recession. I mean, it's like somebody was really trying to mislead people with these groupings.
There is a Republican in charge of the Congressional Budget Office now, but I still think they're the best source of information you're going to get. But I'm with you. This chart is weird because everything is sliced different bucket, different amounts of time.
I think if we have access to the underlying data, it may make sense to redo the years.
Yeah, we'll see it. But the key point I want to make here is when you look at this, they're saying the economy won't grow any faster than this unless you take some kind of heroic and unusual action. 2% or 1.7% is all you're going to get. So anybody that says to you, I'm going to deliver 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, your logical question would be, really? Because that's $1 trillion more deficit than you're even talking about today. Where are you going to get that money?
It's potential labor force by open borders.
If we annex Mexico, maybe, I mean, what's this?
Would Bernie's plans grow it? That's a pretty huge
If you ran
deficit.
a deficit that big, yeah, that's possible.
I mean, isn't that what he's talking about?
I don't know, because he hasn't been really clear about how much he plans to increase the deficit. I think Medicare for All, if it's done right, is not a deficit increaser at all. It should pay for itself. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy to do that. That's if you do it right, that's what should happen. But Social Security, they want to add benefits to people, not just catch up to, because you're supposed to have a 20% decrease in Social Security if we don't change the law. That's going to happen in the early 2030s. Everybody's benefits, not everybody, but beneficiaries the benefits are going to get cut about 20% under current law. So just catching up, just bridging that gap is a big deal. If you want to start giving more benefits on top of that, then you're talking about some big deficit increases. But yeah, if you want to run, we're talking about $1 trillion deficit today. If you ran a $2 trillion deficit or a $3 trillion deficit, you could get the 6% growth probably, but it wouldn't be and this is where we'll talk about inflation in a minute. When you start going above potential, you get into inflation and other kinds of funky risks. Normally, although we have seen a lot of stimulus without inflation, that's what's baffling all these economists is, why aren't we seeing inflation? So let's talk about that a little bit. And I'll get to unemployment first. Similar to this idea of a potential GDP growth rate, meaning that if you try to go above that, you're going to get inflation, there is something called the natural rate of unemployment, which is the same idea. If you get, and this, because unemployment is a negative variable, if you go below, if the unemployment rate gets below the natural rate of unemployment, you're supposed to get inflation. And so what CBO is projecting is for the next several years, we're actually going to be so low on unemployment that we should be getting inflation. That's where that red line is below the orange line. That's what they're saying. That they expect the unemployment rate to be below the natural rate of unemployment. That's sort of the capacity, the lowest you can get. That is sort of the fully employed resources of the United States. They're all on the job. That's what that really means. You're at capacity. If you ran a manufacturing operation, you're running 3 shifts with as many people as you've got. And they're saying, we're going to be even below that. We're going to be really killing it. And what that means is that you're supposed to get inflation. And that's what they're saying here. And the CBO uses a different, they don't use the consumer price index like we show you in the chart. They use this producer, or was it personal consumption expenditures index. It's about 0.5 point below the other one. So when you look at this and you see that things are supposed to come back to 2%, or you hear about the Fed talking about its 2% target, that's what this means. When the Fed is at their 2% target with these numbers, that means the CPI that we use is going to be at 2.5. Okay, so there's about a 0.5 point difference there. What they're saying here is that because they're going to be below the natural rate of unemployment, you should see inflation above that 2% target. You should see the inflation rate increase. This to me is really a minor blip in inflation considering how low that unemployment rate is. And that's really surprising. Historically, I think if you were to go back much further in time, you can even see here in the Bush era when we were in the housing bubble around 2005, that we had inflation in that 3.5 range. This is nothing for inflation. So it's still expected to increase, but this is not much of an increase. Nominal wage growth, same idea, is that because inflation's going up, the labor markets are very tight with low unemployment. You're going to see wages go up. Right now they're about 3%. You're going to 3% nominal rate. You're going to see that go up toward 3.5, 3.6, somewhere in there. So, and then that smooths out over time.
I think from what I've been reading is the economists are all kind of mystified why inflation hasn't been greater and why wage growth hasn't been greater.
Right, and they go together. Wage growth and inflation are going to move together.
Right, and I noticed that in looking at the BLS, there's been a lot of movement of people in jobs, so you would expect the movement to be for more money.
This is one thing, and there's a chart that I think will be helpful. I'll bring it to one of our future meetings. When there's and I'm going to, Carl might have to correct me here, it's called, I believe it's the Phillips curve is the one that relates the unemployment rate and inflation. I think it's the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve, when you use inflation and unemployment, hasn't been as accurate as it used to be. Once, go back 20, 30 years, there was a time when those things worked, meaning as unemployment went really, really low, inflation jumped up, and it was a pretty predictive model. You could do it accurately. Now what they're finding is that you can use a labor force, the prime age labor force participation, you can use that instead of unemployment and get closer to the inflation. And then I'll show you the chart. It's a little bit easier to understand, but there was a study that was done on that, meaning that things have changed in terms of how much of the labor force that we can get back to work, and also the fact that the crisis hurt us in the labor force participation that is coming back is an interesting thing that I don't think they've modeled or are used to modeling out all the way yet. I'll show you the analysis. It'll make more sense when I have some time to look through it. The last thing I'll share here in their economic forecast is the federal funds rate. They're expecting that eventually the Fed will start raising rates again, but again, Once upon a time, the Fed liked to have interest rates at 5% because then they had some ammunition. Now they're talking about, oh, we're running low unemployment for 3 or 4 years. We're only going to get back to a 2.5 or 3% Fed funds rate, which is still extremely low historically. I think this is unrealistic too. I think that we're going to see Fed funds rate that stays very low and may even go lower, because if you look at Europe, they're negative. You look at Japan, and Japan, as much as people pick on Japan for having very low growth, Japan has very low unemployment. So is it bad if you have low unemployment and low growth? Not necessarily, but that's not the US way. We think of let's get growth, and it's different. But here, this federal funds rate is shooting up. I tend to doubt it. I don't think Trump's going to like it if they do. We'll see if we get inflation, in which case we would get the federal funds rate going up, but I don't know. I tend to think in our world, if you've got real potential GDP that's here, I don't think you'll ever get an interest rate that's above your potential GDP growth rate. In other words, if the GDP is 1.7 or 2, your real range of options on your interest rate is 0 to 2. Now, not everybody would agree with me, but I think you're going to see very low interest rates in the future. I wouldn't count on them going up to 3 and 4%. Any questions on the economic forecast? Does it seem reasonable to you? Like when you look at those numbers, did any of these charts surprise you?
The wage growth shows about 3%. If you look on the right-hand side there, it's what, about 3%?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you said inflation.
Now, this is nominal.
You said inflation for the long term was 2.5?
Right, the CPI, right, that's right, yep.
Okay.
Mhm.
So for a median income of 71,000, I just did a little calculation, that's $30 a month.
You're not getting much of a raise. Yeah, you're not. And historically, Carl shared the slide earlier, 1.3% under Obama, real wage growth the last 3 years, 0.8% under Trump. Neither of those is particularly horrible, right? I mean, I think Trump may be a little low, but I mean, 1.3 isn't bad if I remember
Well,
right.
if you look at the real median wage for a full-time worker, from, full-time male worker from 1973, it was relatively flat from 1973 to very recently.
Yeah.
I mean, there were peaks around it went down with the mid-70s recession, came back up around 79, 80, went down with the recessions in 80 and then 81, 82. Got back up around 99, 2000, then went down. So the fact that we've got, real median household income setting records in 2016, 2017, 2018, and probably again in 2019.
So don't complain about $30 a month increase?
In terms of a real increase, Now, what most of us, happen in our careers is that we went from an entry-level job and built up, but then, those medians are based upon someone with the same experience every year kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that they're not taking into account career progression and then career collapse towards the end of the work.
I mean, this is just a reminder, kind of summarize it too. I think this is the slide that sort of tells the story. They're saying our unemployment rate is going to be very low for the next 3 or 4 years. And that means the economy is going to be more or less booming for the next 3 or 4 years. If you consider what we're doing today, booming, that's where we are. It's going to be in good shape for several more years if
I
they're
use the
correct.
word holding at a good level. Booming is just the wrong word.
Yeah, I don't like booming either.
Booming is the wrong
I'm
word.
going to use the term language.
Well,
This incredibly low level of unemployment that is just amazingly low, so.
We're going to continue to have a good economy and based on, continued growth that started back in 2009, 2010, albeit at a slightly slower pace now than before.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So the driver of the economy for the last 9, 10 years is the fact that we've had increasingly lower unemployment and people have money to spend and cycle into the consumer.
I think that's true. I think the stock market has done very well, and I think Christine would probably tell you the Fed's been helping out quite a bit with their money printing. So I think you've got a combination of factors. There's a lot of monetary stimulus being Fed versus fiscal stimulus, the government. But between the Fed and the unemployment rate being really low, I think the number of people working, it's a decent economy. So,
Private debt hit $1 trillion.
The what?
Private debt, mere humans,
Right.
hit $1 trillion.
That's more than I need.
which number are you talking about? What number is this?
Debt.
Personal debt.
Personal debt, credit card debt or
Yeah,
auto?
credit, auto.
It's higher, I think, than that. It was like 14 or something, 13 or 14 it hit recently, but it did, it just
Well,
hit
it
a
hit the
record level.
news.
It just hit a record level, yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
just,
think it was
about
a per year.
Didn't it?
I think the growth
Student-
was per year.
Didn't it?
In a year, it went up a trillion, that would make sense,
Oh,
you make
okay.
it right
It went up
there.
$1 trillion
Yeah,
in 1
that
year.
makes more sense, it went up a trillion, but it's like 13 or 14 trillion debt.
yeah.
That they
Yeah,
want
for
to raise
personal.
interest rates for.
So,
Sorry.
the banks are inventing money, because that's what they do. And, you know, the fundamental difference between a bank inventing money and the government inventing money is you pay back the bank, you never pay back the government. That's the difference.
Questions here? Yep.
Yeah, now, the Federal Reserve has been reducing its balance sheet by at least up until fairly recently.
Right, until September, I think it switched it because they were having trouble with the
Yeah,
repo market.
That was a bubble. That was.
But they kept doing that, they're still,
That was probably the cause, was that they were buying bonds faster than they could, than the banks could manage their reserves. But
I thought that's reversed. They had to give the banks the money to buy the bonds.
that's what they did.
Yeah.
No, but prior to that, they had been reducing they've been buying bonds out of the banks to reduce their own balance sheet, because, you know, in 2008, they just made a left-hand entry into the balance sheet of $4 trillion and started buying bonds.
it's handy when you can do that. I would love to be able to just print some money. Hey, I need a new car, can I just pull it out of the air?
Check with the MMT guys about that.
Well,
It actually works.
We're due for an MMT update.
Found a country with their own currency.
But, but is the net, are you saying that even though the Fed is reducing its balance sheet and had been till, they probably actually are going back to that.
Well, the Fed reducing its balance sheet,
Is the net currency in the system still increasing?
I don't know.
Because.
It's a good question.
The Fed coming down, the
Right.
Treasury printing money like, a mad lithographer, and the banks creating.
I don't know if you can call what the federal government does printing the money. The Treasury, what the Fed is doing, I think of as printing the money. With the government, I'm not sure I would call it printing the money when the federal government does.
All we have to do is look up the M1 to M3 money supply.
They
But we can
simply
answer-
spend it.
we
They
can't
don't have
answer
to
that.
have it.
No.
They simply spend it.
We can look at the money supply, but I think the Fed, at least since September, is back to stimulus mode again. They also cut the interest rates again, which was a stimulus. The government is running these giant deficits that are continuing to get bigger. We saw the statistics earlier on how the federal government is boosting GDP by adding to the deficit. They have to keep adding to the deficit to keep boosting
So
GDP.
you're saying that the
So-
net money supply is actually going up faster than the utility up?
I don't know. I have to look at those numbers. That'd be we'll take it as a to-do. We can get those numbers and we'll take a look and see what's happening. But I'm seeing a lot of stimulus in the system, let's put it that way.
Blatantly, that's an MMT question.
So the question, I think what you're attempting to ask is, how much money is there? Yes, it's always going up.
Is it going up faster than the utility of that money? And I think the answer,
Well, the money is being burdened. Basically, it's being wrapped into a piece of paper and put in a safe, and the safe is locked. It's not spendable. Okay.
Let's take it for next time. Carl and I will try to figure all that out, and if you see articles on it, send them to us, we'll put it together for this meeting. But yeah, I'm curious, but my view is a lot of stimulus going on. So let's talk about trade. This is also part of the Bureau of Economic Analysis piece. Before we get into that, just a couple numbers. I'm not gonna go into all the craziness around the trade deficit because it's really complicated and I haven't rehearsed very carefully a trade deficit explanation because it gets really hairy. But let's put it this way. In terms of the number, the trade deficit actually fell a little bit last year, which is a Trump goal. Came down, I'll show you the exact number in a little bit, but it came down. The blue lines here are on the left axis, that's the billions of dollars of the trade deficit. So you see that blue line in 2019 came down just a little. And then the brown or orange line is on the right axis, that's the percent of GDP. That actually came down a little bit too. It came down from 3% of GDP to 2.9. So one of Trump's goals is to reduce the trade deficit. He met this year, although it went up in the last couple of years. Whether that's a good goal or not, well, let's table that for another day, but there's a debate on both sides of that argument. Here are the actual numbers. So you can see there's more than you need here, but the 2018 and 2019 numbers, are on the left-hand side. You can see that the dollar change was about almost $11 billion less, and it came down about 1.7% in terms of the size of that change. So 10.9 billion out of 627 is that 1.7% it came down. That's not a percent of GDP. The percent of GDP is below that. So the trade deficit came down from 3% to 2.9. You guys seeing that? That's the far left column under the purple header. That's the total. Trade deficit has goods and services in it. The U.S. runs a services surplus, but we have a goods deficit. And that's why you see the big negative number there for 2019, 865, 985 goods deficit, but a services surplus of 249, 229. I need to get a laser pointer, but that's these numbers right here. These two
So we're
numbers.
selling less services and buying more goods.
And here's the change in the goods and services. And then over here, you get the exports and the imports that make up that.
Isn't it true that when you read most articles, they're not talking about services, they're talking about goods?
They are with China in particular. And I'll show you that slide next, and I'll show you what's going on with just China. But what this is saying here is the trade deficit is almost the same as last year. It's $10 billion on that. It's down 1.7% versus last year. And what you'll see though, what I'm going to show you in a second, is that the China trade deficit is down dramatically, like 80-something billion. So what's happening is countries are sourcing elsewhere beside China. So if China, we've got all these tariffs and issues happening with China, they're saying, fine, I'll get my stuff in Vietnam. I'll get my stuff in Korea, or I'll make it here, okay? But they are finding ways to get around China. So let's take a look at what happened just in China. So these are the exports over the last 3 years. So our exports to China have fallen from 130 billion to 106, which is, Trump would like it to go the other way. But on the other hand, our imports, after going up from 17 to 18, fell from 540 billion to 452. Did you guys see that in the middle? These are the imports. And they peaked here in 2018 and they fell into 2019. So 540 to 452. The reason I'm showing that as a negative is because of the way the math works on the GDP calculation, X minus M, the exports minus imports. Exports are a positive to your GDP, imports are a negative to your GDP. And here, what happened is that negative is less, okay? And that's what Trump's goal was, is to get that the amount of imports reduced from China, get that trade balance down, and that's what he did. So the trade balance overall, the trade deficit fell from 420 with China to 346. That's the rightmost part. So the difference is $74 billion, 20% decline. So if his goal is to reduce the trade deficit with China, he was successful, but to the extent that the trade deficit is sort of almost the same, just tells you some things about the battle against a trade deficit, is that it's just going to go somewhere else unless you change some more fundamental things. Just beating up on China means that they'll just do production, people will source elsewhere and import from other countries, and that's basically what happened. If China had a big decrease here, but the rest of the world, including the rest of the world, it was almost unchanged, other places we made up for it. I'm going to tell you something, and I'll do this in a future session, we'll explain it in more detail. There are a couple of video papers on the trade deficit and about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. They're a few years old. They're from like 2003, 2004. They said the trade deficit has almost nothing to do with trade policy. And you might say, what? Imports and exports are the trade deficit. How can you tell me that a trade deficit has nothing to do with trade policy? And this is a perfect example of, we have all this aggressive sounding trade policy with China. What happened to our trade deficit? It changed with China, went up elsewhere, right? Because it didn't change in total. The idea of a trade deficit, this is a complicated thing that I'll throw it out there, and if you want to chew on it and research it, I know probably Dave back there will do a little bit of digging on this, and you've heard this before. Where the trade deficit comes from is actually has more to do with the amount of savings your country's doing. Because if you are importing a lot more than you're able to pay for, you've got to borrow from other countries to do that, and that's your trade deficit. If you save a lot of money and are able to pay for all that stuff, if you can just pay for your Beamer, you don't run these big deficits because you don't have to borrow the money from foreign countries. So it gets into the financial side of it is a really critical part of this, and not just the goods physically moving back and forth or the services. It has a lot to do with the money. And the money can actually drive the trade deficit in ways that are very subtle. And so, again, that's just a tease for this, but trade policy, you don't solve a trade deficit with trade policy. As strange as that sounds, put that in the back of your head and chew on that for our next meeting, and I'll bring some stuff on that we can get into. So now let's talk what the CBO said about the trade policy. What is this trade, what are these tariffs gonna do? And almost all of them are with China, so don't worry about, okay, there's a little with Canada, a little bit with other countries, just ignore that. It's massive percent of it is with China. So here we go. And you guys can read just as well as I can. Would reduce real GDP over the projection period over the next decade. And this is not hypothetical, this is what they're saying based on the policies that have been put in place. Here's what we think is going to happen, assuming these tariffs stay in place. The most impacts can happen up front, 2020, and then fade over time. Reduce the level of GDP by 0.5%, raise consumer prices by 0.5% in 2020. Tariffs are projected to reduce average real household income by almost $1,300. Okay? Again, heavier impact in 2020, fading over time. To me, that's the headline statistic. If you're a Democrat, you want to put a statistic in people's faces, that's the one you use. And then CBO expects to be, okay, so then they go into that too. Lower the GDP even 10 years out by just a little bit. Because what they expect to happen here is this trade policy, people are going to find ways around it. If you just tariff the heck out of China, our supply chains will go around it, and they will build out other countries' supply chains, and things will probably not change very much. Again, one of the things that the CBO said, going back to my earlier point about the financials, they said one of the best ways to reduce a trade deficit, you know what their two things came up? Reduce your healthcare costs. You would never think that would have anything to do with this, right? Reduce your healthcare costs. And number two, what was the other one was fascinating? Get people to use their 401ks more. Force them to save more. In other words, by reducing the budget deficit, by addressing your healthcare costs, and by getting people to save more, by getting them to opt into to force them into their 401ks, your national savings goes up, and so you don't need to borrow as much from other countries to get their stuff. That's how you solve a trade deficit. We'll go into this next time. I keep babbling about it because it's so fascinating, but we'll talk about that in the next one. But just keep that in mind. Trade policy isn't how you solve a trade deficit. It's an amazing thing.
The money collected through tariffs reduces that year's debt, right?
Reduces the budget, correct.
So
About $70 billion this
Yeah.
last year. Yep.
But Dave, back on that previous screen,
Yep.
that $1,200 seems to be the most significant
Right.
part
That's
to
it.
the average consumer.
Right.
It's a hidden $1,200 tax, is what it really is.
So I got my $30 a month extra on wage growth, and now I'm spending $100. I got to spend $100 a month extra.
Well, then of course you got your $900 Trump tax cut, which just got more than reversed by this for the most part. So yes, but you made a good point. It's hidden. Costs of goods that you're buying should be a little higher. Toothpaste, other things should be a little more expensive.
And yet that would seem to be inflationary. If it's reducing my real household income by that amount, why is the inflation?
In theory, inflation would be even lower than CBO is talking about if we didn't do these tariffs.
Okay.
Right, they added a little bit to the prices. And yes, they are rather subtle. Here are some more statistics on that. Now, here's why. This is a little bit more of the why. Why does it slow down U.S. economic activity? First, stuff gets more expensive, so you don't have as much money left in your pocket. Second, businesses slow their investment because of the uncertainty. And third, people will retaliate against us so we don't export as much as we used to export before. Those are the three reasons why your GDP gets hit, according to CBO, from tariffs. Okay? All of these things lower U.S. output, but also, as you brought up, Paul, tariff revenues reduce the deficit, and which also means that you, in theory, have more resources for private investment in later years, meaning the government's not taking the money private investment can invest in. And here's your statistic. Customs duty revenue increased from 41 billion in 2018 to 71 billion in 2019, reducing the deficit accordingly. So those deficits under Trump, as much as they are larger than they would have been before, this actually offsets some of that. They would have been worse if you didn't have this kind of, the 70 billion coming in.
So the increase in tariff revenue, which is basically paid for by U.S. companies.
Yeah, right?
But then we turned around and we gave subsidies to the farm trade, agricultural,
28 billion?
That's socialism.
in a huge.
Corporate socialism.
It's just about that difference in the,
It's amazing. I mean, but you're right. I mean, I don't know the exact number. I remember 30 billion is the number that sticks in my mind for the farm subsidies, but you're right. That would be also in that budget deficit calculation already. It's not part of this. In other words, it's not netted here. It'd be interesting if it were, if you had trade impacts sort of put together in the budget line, but they don't do it that way. They've got it in other categories.
It'd be also interesting, I don't want you to do this, but it'd also be interesting to know how much of that money goes to John Doe farmer versus Monsanto, ConAgra,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
I'm sure it's going heavily to larger farmers.
That's exactly, it goes to
the big hit to the small farmers, they're into the bankruptcy.
yep, that's what that's what my father always said. I was born on a farm.
So yeah, if you guys want a homework project, figure out why I said that trade deficit solving has nothing to do with trade policy, and you're gonna have some fun with that. Okay, now let's talk about the little bit of the kind of the summary of the tariff activity, kind of where we stand, because I got completely lost when they were saying, all right, so you put in a layer, there's this tranche of tariffs, and there's another tranche of tariffs, but we're not going to apply those, or we're going to roll that back. And I was like, what are you talking about? So I think the draft presentation that we sent out the other day actually had a couple of extra charts that lay this out, but you can see it in the budget and economic outlook. They've got the charts that go into great detail on this, but here's the bottom line. As of January 7th, this was just before this trade deal was signed, the phase one deal. So this was just before that. CBO laid all this stuff out. And so I'm going to use the next page for a second. Here, as of the 7th, right before the trade deal, was what was the level of tariffs that were out there. So you had $395 billion worth of U.S. imports. So 17% of our imports had some kind, were tariffed in some way. So it was 395 billion, or 17% of our tariffs were there was some kind of import on that. There was some kind of tariff on that import. And let me just go back up a second, look at our trade statistics. If you look at our imports, which is the yellow over here on the right-hand side, we had, in 2019, $3.1 trillion worth of imports. Can you see that? 3,116,517? That's in millions, that's the tariffs, it's $3.1 trillion. Sorry, not tariffs, jeez. That's the imports. 3.1 in total, 3.1 trillion in imports, and the goods and the services breakdown are right next to that, okay? So 17% of that is this 395. Okay, 395 of that 3.1 has some kind of tariff applied to it, and they show it by category of how much of it is in which kind of category. You can see the capital goods, except autos is where a lot of that is. The 181 is the capital goods, consumer goods 105. Now that gets at what you pay, like consumer goods, you would see that cost right away. Like I'm not sure if washers and dryers go into capital goods or consumer goods, but there were tariffs put specifically on those, you would see an increase in prices on those. On the other side, on the exports, $143 billion worth of exports are being tariffed by other countries, meaning that's the retaliation, is being applied to 143, and you can see which bucket it's in by the different categories. So they hit us pretty hard on food, feed, and beverages, but the big one was industrial supplies and materials at 51. Again, almost all this is China, even though there's other countries that are involved. The 90 or plus % of this is China related. So this is how much China retaliated. Now, they didn't have as much room, right? Because if you look at China, we're only exporting 130 billion or so to China. 100, well, last year was 106, but we applied these tariffs to these categories. But we hit a lot of imports with them, 395. So now the rates, here is the phase 1 trade deal that was signed and what it did. So China, and who knows how much of this is actually going to happen and how much of this is enforceable. This was a nice summary article that Reuters did, which is at the bottom. Okay, so you can check out the Reuters article. It was very just a bunch of, here's what's in the deal. Here, they literally read the deal and they summarized it in an article. So China's going to increase purchases, allegedly by 200 billion over 2 years versus the 2017 level. Okay, which is pretty good if they'll do it. And they used for comparison, they said China bought 130 billion in US goods, right? Approximately, there's the 130, see it? On the exports on the left. And then they made specific commitments. So adding up to this 200 billion are specific commitments in different buckets: manufacturing, energy, services, agriculture. So far so good. US import tariffs were cut on 120 billion worth of Chinese goods, what they call the 9-1 tranche. Whatever was put in on September 1st, we are cutting that rate, which would have just gone into effect on Valentine's Day, because we love China, so we put in a Valentine's Day treat for them. 25% rate on 250 billion of Chinese goods remains. So that, and if you do the math, 120 plus 250, 370 billion still have tariffs. So what we did here, the numbers are close, this is 395. We still have tariffs on almost all of that. We just cut back some of them. We cut back on 120 billion of that. We also agreed we were going to add, so on top of the 390, we were going to add another 160. We said, whoa, we're not going to do that. We're going to hold off on that. China's planned retaliatory tariffs were suspended, what they called the 12-15 tranche. So they were going to reply to our 160. They said, we're not going to do it if you're not going to do it. And then they also said later, after the deal, they agreed to reduce the tariffs a little bit on 75 billion worth of goods. Okay? So also China said we're going to strengthen our intellectual property protection. Again, the enforcement mechanisms are very unclear. There's a lot of debate about whether any of this is going to happen. Because, again, this deal was sort of put together in a hurry. Reduce pressure on foreign companies to transfer technology in exchange for market access. The yuan is down about 12% versus the first time we put in the tariffs. So one of the ways that China got around the tariffs was to say, well, if you're going to try to make our stuff more expensive, we're going to devalue our currency, so we offset that. So they did that. Which is one of those things. Another thing about using trade policy to try to get rid of your trade deficit, China is smart. They just said, fine, we'll devalue our currency. And what happens when you devalue your currency? You stimulate your exports. Your currency's weaker. Dollar gets relatively stronger. So that stimulates Chinese exports, okay? They're not dumb. And then also improving access to the financial market. Apparently, you know how always Goldman Sachs has got to get their 2 cents. So our big financial companies apparently are going to get some more inroads into China than we had before. So nice summary of this is in that Reuters article. But you can see this 395 is still being applied. This 143 is still being applied. And some parts of that, the tariff rate was reduced. Okay, but the goods are still, the tariffs are still being applied to that volume of goods. So in terms of, was this an amazingly good trade deal that we should be bragging about? It depends on what happens. Will China do these purchases in the first set of bullets? And then will these rule changes down at the bottom happen where China does strengthen the intellectual property protection and not always stealing patented, copyrighted digital property? letting our companies go in there and do more business. And hopefully not devaluing their currency any further, because they already did it. Remember, we did label them a currency manipulator for a while, then we took that back, okay? Any questions on this one? Yeah.
Back on the 80 billion, the reduction on the trade deficit on China, what's the relationship between, was that caused by the tariffs, and will that 80 billion be altered by this phase one agreement?
The first part, yes, definitely was because of the tariffs. Now, will it be altered by the phase one agreement? I don't know the connection, to be honest. I would assume that if China opens the door to us, we will be reducing our tariffs over time, and that would encourage that number to start going back up a little. But let me say it another way. The imports from China, let me rephrase that. The imports from China, you see where the 540 became 452? Yeah. Let's say that if things, let's say we get back to being buddies with China, more or less, just competitors and not adversaries, that 452 may go back to 540, right? But the exports to China should jump, right? If they buy that extra 200 billion, so this trade deficit should still fall more, I would hope. Like if we add, let's do a little math here. Yeah, let's not. I would say if you're going to add 200 billion to the exports to China, and you're going to put 100 billion back on the imports, you pick up 100 billion in trade deficit.
So if our objective was to hurt China, then we met that objective?
We did. Oh, definitely. No doubt about it. Yeah, and we hurt ourselves too, as I listed, $1,000 a family or whatever it is. But we definitely hurt China, no doubt. The trade deficit the trade deficit is lower with China now. Their trade surplus with us is less, hurts their GDP.
And we really messed with the supply chains all the way around the world.
That's right.
So we hurt Europe and everybody else.
Yeah, but we helped Vietnam.
Right, we did help some smaller countries in Asia.
Well, you have to understand that the executive director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam is very happy about that.
Yeah, right.
My sister Mary.
Right. Yeah, those other smaller countries that are getting the benefit. But remember, again, I just love this saying that Steve BO talked about. I mean, if you want to solve your trade deficit problem, do not do it with trade policy, which I just thought that was hilarious. Okay. Oh, yeah, sure.
Things into perspective. Yeah, thank you.
Which one do you want to look at?
Right there.
Okay.
Okay, so China's going to increase products and services by 200 billion. Now, from 2017. 2017 is a total of 186 billion, so they're going to more than double their purchases from the United States.
Right.
How much totally does the United States export? I mean, what percent is that 200 billion? Is it something that's doable, or is this, a real
No,
reach?
it's doable. I mean, here's the number on exports. We export, in 2019, we exported 2.4, almost 2.5 trillion dollars. Do you see that in the green?
Okay.
2.5 trillion in 2019. So 200 of 2.5, I mean, it's not even 10%, right? 250 would be 10%. So it's less than a 10% increase in our exports.
But
It's
I read
doable.
somewhere, of that 200 billion, quite a bit of it was agriculture.
Right.
Okay? And somehow the farmers are gonna produce 20% more.
Those cows are going to be busy. Yep.
Yeah.
The
How are they
soybeans,
gonna do
right.
that?
We're going to
Now
have to
start milking the bulls.
How are we going to do it, Paul?
We're gonna start milking those bulls.
Start milking
Every
the
morning. They might have changed their mind, but
We're going to squeeze blood out of the rocks. That's right. All right. Can we show the video?
I don't think they have a problem producing.
Can we show the video of?
You'll have to do it from there.
Okay, tell me how to do it.
Click on Chrome at the bottom.
Okay.
That's the power. Click on the middle one.
This lady did a great job of her fact check, so let's see how this goes here.
This Friday, something huge.
How do I adjust it?
We tasked you with fact-checking on your area of expertise, the economy.
I note several handwritten pages in kind of frantic Sharpie, I think is the motif.
I wouldn't say frantic. Here's the thing.
Please.
We knew that the president was going to lead with the economy, and he has every right to. The economy is strong. We are at historic low unemployment numbers. The stock market, which is different from the economy, is soaring. He walked in tonight after a record day in the stock market, and you could say, lots of people aren't investors. They're not, you're right. They're not buying Apple stock, but millions of ordinary Americans do have retirement accounts and or 401ks. And last year, the S&P was up 29%. That makes a lot of Americans feel good. The question is, why doesn't the president leave it there? Why does he start by saying, I took us out of years of economic decline. It was an economic reversal. I unwound failed economic policies. What in the world is he talking about? We are in the 10th year of an economic expansion, which was obviously started in the Obama administration. The president has seen 6.7 million jobs created in the last 3 years. You know who created more? Obama. In the last 3 years of his administration, the unemployment rate fell faster under Obama. And GDP, when the president says it's the greatest economy ever, he ranks 7th among his 11 predecessors as far as growth goes. And you can't forget, what's goosed that growth? Record tax cuts for corporate America. So the question is, why on earth wouldn't the president leave well enough alone? He's got a strong economy. Because to what we just heard in the last segment when Rashida Tlaib said she was triggered, that's exactly what the Republicans want to do. They know what the facts are, and they know what framing it incorrectly is. And by framing it incorrectly, you're right. People are frantically fact-checking, and Twitter is a flutter. But the State of the Union isn't a debate. It's a presentation. And the president got to paint a picture, not take a snapshot. And painting that picture works for a lot of Americans.
Is that consistent with sort of your thinking about the economy? Have we explained it correctly, or have we framed it correctly? So, what did you think? Was she too nice to Trump, or sure? What is she?
It's on some levels, yes, but you know.
What do you guys think? In other words, did you want to slap her for the first minute, and then you said, okay, she's all right after that because she was saying more pro-Obama things in the second half? No, you were all right? This one.
The question is, how does that play out in the 2020 election for the Democrats?
It's awful hard to get people to change where they're going when the economy is good. A lot of us remember unemployment, or that in my case, for many years, hearing that bullet whistle past your ear. I mean, there were years when I could not buy line printer paper for my office. It was that tight. And it doesn't, those memories stick pretty good when it comes to an election.
So
What I'm struck by is when I get into these discussions on the economy and who's got the better economy, Trump, Obama, whatever, is the number of people who seem to have forgotten the Great Recession, particularly those in their mid-30s. And I don't know why, because they should have really had problems getting jobs in the 2008 and 2009 and 2010 years. But it's kind of like the majority of people are buying the greatest economy ever. It's best for all the minorities ever. It's like you almost can't engage in that area because people just don't believe you if you bring up things like the GDP hasn't really gone anywhere. Look what the debt's gone. It's doubled. The deficit is doubled. It's like just falls off their back.
I've said for years that the messaging is terrible. The word stimulus, economic stimulus, is that's a four-letter word in a lot of communities. We never hear Democrats use it, but it shouldn't be called that. It should be called stimulus, because that's really what it is. And if you want to find the dirty words, you make them the message. We don't do it.
I mean, have you heard Democrats talking like she was, with that kind of forcefulness about the economy, saying, you know,
Nobody's talking about the economy, they're talking about everything else.
Except a little bit more.
Yes.
She will get into
Yes,
it.
You know, but to the extent, you know, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders talking about the economy, they're talking about, you know, how it's a terrible economy
Yeah,
for everybody.
but it isn't.
And, you know, they're talking to that 12% of the people who believe it's a bad economy.
right,
Um,
it's not a bad economy, and it isn't, that's right.
And
And the Democrats have to strategize how they're gonna do it, and Carl asked the question last time, sort of, how should the Democrats talk about the economy? And I'll repeat the question, because I think a lot of people were wrestling with it last time, and I don't think there's a solution to it. Bill?
To me, when you listen to the people who you hear talking about it, it depends on what age group they are, what race they are, what Democrat, you know, where you go. You don't hear the broad sweep of who's responding to the economy, you know, and that is distorting a lot of message, you know, you don't, like you said, the people who graduated couldn't find jobs in the recession. You don't get a lot of news people asking those people. You get the news people asking the 50, 55, 60. Well, what about the millennials and stuff? They're like, they don't get a lot of attention. So it's a wide sweep of people in the Democratic Party based on age, gender, race. You know, we come in many facets, it's just not one. And that's distorting the picture. Okay, yeah, good economy, but it depends on who you ask, what these people are doing, how much they're making, and stuff like that. So it's very
the economy is different in Naperville than
I think,
Danville.
I know your audience, okay.
I think the reason that Bernie resonates so well is he's talking particularly to the millennials about the college debt that they incurred. A lot of them went back to school when they couldn't find jobs, et cetera, to get another degree. And what we see, or at least that I see, is the first-time home buyer is really lagging. It's just nowhere near where it should be. And that's got a lot of people concerned about where we're going. But I hear Bernie talking about the forgiveness of the debt, but I don't hear anybody addressing the overall economy, if there's a way to do it.
And one of the things I'm fascinated about is, if you want to argue about the economy, to me, it's relatively simple. If your credit card debt is going up, the economy is not working for you.
Or if you're working 3 jobs.
If you're working 3 jobs.
If you're working 3 jobs, the economy is not working for you. How is this message not getting disseminated?
Because it depends on who they have on TV and who they're asking.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting because not so much this month, but the last couple of months, I've read a lot about states that are red states that are not getting nearly the impact that the major cities are getting on the economy. And yet they are buying in to the Trump great economy.
There's
But it's-
news.
Well, and you've heard me say this before, I don't think the economy is really the main selling point of Trump. In other words, even if the economy were lousy or were the exact same as Obama's, I mean, Trump is a national identity, racism, and immigration guy. The economy is a rationalization that people use. And you see it because you know from looking at all these statistics that you can make a very good argument that the economy was better in the end of the Obama administration, or that what Trump is doing is a continuation of Obama trend plus a lot of debt on top of it. Okay? So once upon a time, debt used to matter. Remember? I mean, the Tea Party and the deficits and debt were a prime issue. Everybody was talking about this in the first parts of the Obama administration, and now you never hear about it anymore. And the Democrats have allowed that to happen, meaning Democrats have not hit on the deficit. And the deficit was in really good shape when at the end of Obama administration. I mean, deficit was below historical average as a percent of GDP in 2014. So the Democrats need a strategy, but when a Trump person says, I'm voting for Trump because of the economy, that's not really the reason. That's just how they rationalize it. Their issues are not, economy is not number one on the Trump person's list. It's immigration, it's the national identity thing, it's building the wall, it's that kind of stuff, the symbolic kind of, we're white people, that's our team, don't mess with my team kind of thinking. And then the economy is just an excuse, I think. So
This afternoon, I was reading an article from Psychology Today. It's a year old, but it's called a psychological analysis of Trump's support. It's a fairly long article, even for that magazine. And the guy goes through, he's a sidekick, he goes through 13 different issues, all psychological issues of why the support is so rigid. And it's basically looking at different personality profile issues and alignment. And many of his supporters will hit on several of those, some of which are immediately tied to racism. Some of them tied to lack of curiosity, authoritarian behaviors. But when you read through that and then you try to talk to somebody and match up what I hear coming back with what I've had this article on open tab for a long time, but I keep reading it. And so, and when I match the conversation with this, and the alignment is uncanny.
send it out, send it to Carl so we can share it with the group. We'll all take a look at it. We'll bring it up in the next one. I mean, I just think that you can sit down with the data we've given you. You can sit down with a Trump person if they're willing to listen and go through it. And by the end of it, they should agree that, yeah, they can just look at the jobs chart, the first one. Trump inherited, he started on third base. And now he's saying, I hit a triple, okay? That's what he's doing. And you can, and I'm gonna show you, as we go through this fact check some more, I'm gonna show you some of the details, but it's pretty clear that the economy got boosted by a lot of debt, and if you're okay with that, great, but I think most of those people don't even think about it that far. It's just they hear the propaganda, the economy's the best ever, and they want desperately to believe it because they want to support their guy. And they don't want to look in the mirror and say, geez, I'm an anti-immigrant racist. I'd rather be able to say Trump's awesome because of the economy, and that's a really easy sell for them. And the Democrats have to get up and say this. They never do, but we got to say it. I think we have to hit these guys with it. And we've been real, I'm waiting for, like, Bernie Sanders is not shy. Elizabeth Warren is not shy. I think Buttigieg, and then Biden is like, well, I get along with Republicans. They're really my friends, and I think he needs to get past that because that's not going to work. So, yeah.
Okay, two things. Number one, I think that a lot of Trump supporters really do believe this is a great economy, best ever. Second subtitle, Bill, when you talk about 30-something's best economy ever, remember how old they were in 99, 2000, when, you could get a good job if you could spell IT. But the other thing is, you talk about...
And some of them made it through the next year.
Yeah. But also, when you talk about calling them out on racism and stuff, I don't think that's a winner. I think that you have a lot of middle-of-the-road independents that, maybe voted for Trump, that, you label them a racist, and you're gonna get a whole bunch of backlash on that. And I think and it may be true, but I think it's a losing political.
It's like calling them deplorables.
Right,
yeah.
I don't think that's a winner politically.
Yeah. That may be right. If I were a political candidate, I'd think twice about saying that too. I definitely would, but I think I would eventually do it, and the reason is I think the country needs to hear it. I think a lot of people are not ready for that. They don't want to believe it about themselves, and I think it's time for national level people to just say it. Because Obama really avoided it as much as he could. He didn't want to go there. He didn't want to single it out. He just did his job as if everybody was sort of the same color to a large extent. And there's an argument to be made for that, but I would like to see people stand up and say, it's time for you Republicans, you're off base, you guys are outside the realm of okay behavior. You need, and here's why you're outside that realm. You need to get back in the circle. You're outside of what's okay to be a US person. You're not part of this culture right now, you're something else. I want to hear them. I want to hear our leaders say that, and they have not. But I get why they're not saying it, because they would offend a lot of people probably, but they need to wake up some people, I think.
They'll lose some elections.
Yeah, they could. So let's look at some of these fact checks. So let's dig into this a little bit, and some of these points we'll keep talking about. Let me make sure I get back here. Here we go. Okay. So first of all, this idea that Trump turned the economy around is a very, I think a lot of Republicans want to believe that desperately, and it's a very important part of Trump getting reelected, and we have to attack that very strongly. And here's a bunch of data on this, but how you digest that into a message for people, whether you use an example like I said, like Trump inherited an economy that was on third base and he's saying he hit a triple. I would love to hear a Democrat say that in a debate. Just nail him with it. That would be an awesome, and even if they really want to be mean, link it to the fact that he inherited $400 million from his dad and said he was self-made. Put that together in a sentence. Boom. I mean, I was waiting for that. I'm like, please, somebody say that. But this is.
Did Bloomberg get on the debate stage?
Did he say something like that?
No, I said if.
Oh, he would say it. Okay. Yeah. I mean, hit him with it. I mean, we're so nice to these guys. But here's a bunch of things. So, and we covered a lot of these slides. Number of persons with jobs in record territory since May 2014. Job creation rate faster under Obama. Unemployment rate?
On job creation rate, I think we may want to go back to annual numbers as opposed to monthly, because I think that those,
Too close.
are the monthlies, but if you talk about, 500,000 fewer jobs a year,
Okay, I like that.
I think that's a more
It's got
meaningful
more
number
meat to
than,
it. Yeah.
13,000 a month.
Yeah, or 1.5 million more under Obama, in 3 years.
Oh,
Yeah. 500,000 a year on average. Unemployment rate was already 4.7, and the historical average unemployment rate is about 5.8 or 5.6, depending on how long a period of time you go back. I think I did, what did I do here? I think I went back to 1990 and it was 5.8. If you go all the way back to like 1930s or something, it's like 5.6. But still.
Was it already in record territory on the day Obama?
No. It didn't.
Well, it was below the historical average, but it was not record here.
But it was well below historical average, meaning when someone says, I turned around a failing economy, which is what Trump has been saying,
Right.
you already had a below historical average unemployment rate, well better, almost a full point better. So in fact, if you look back at the Federal Reserve was starting to raise interest rates at the end of 2015, December of 2015, they started to raise interest rates. So for almost a year before the election, the Fed had already decided this economy is strong enough to start raising interest rates. Real median household income hit a record in 2016 and it continued in 17 and 18. One thing about that though, the bad news for Obama was he didn't get that statistic until September of 2017. It lags a year, which hurt. The stock market was already at record level. It had hit a record level on December 13th and then kind of went sideways or down a little bit. GDP growth was one area where it's 2.3% average in the last 3 years under Obama. Almost the same as Trump. The uninsured is one of the holes that the Democrats have to be going after Trump on. There are about 2 million more people without health insurance just by 2018. By 2019, it's probably another million. So you got about 3 million. Yeah, go ahead.
Your football field analogy that you had way far back, I think it'd be too hard to get you to go back there. But in a real game of football, if somehow, one team maker takes it from the 1 yard line all the way down to the 90-yard line, and another team maker takes it across and gets the touchdown, which of the two team members is it that gets celebrated? It's always the guy.
It's the second guy, right? I know.
And the reason I'm making this analogy is I think that's the situation we're in, frankly.
He's getting credit for the touchdown.
He's getting credit for the touchdown.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter that 3 or 4 other people might have helped him get to the touchdown, whether they were blocking or whether they were even carrying the ball. It's the guy who takes it across the line, who everybody cheers for, who everybody lifts up and celebrates and jumps the champagne or whatever on, blah, blah, blah.
Yep. And it's
You'll note that football field doesn't cross a goal line.
I noticed that picture did not, but that's my
Right,
point.
but no.
If you look at it that way.
That was intentional.
the 50, but yeah, to
So
his
that's an
point.
area where I think maybe, because if you look at some of these historical records or near records, that's sort of like a touchdown in a way.
Well, I mean,
You can argue that this guy didn't carry the ball for most of the field, that somebody else did. But the instinctive reaction, I mean, I'm just saying politically, what you got to deal with is the fact that there's this instinctive act that people in a game of football or anything else are going to celebrate the guy who made it across the line.
Yeah, that's.
he improved the field position a little. He didn't make it across any line.
This is, no, I'm with you, I understand.
He understands what
We
you're
have to
saying.
try to overcome that, we have to say that, we have to make it clear, and also point out a character flaw that Trump has, well, obviously, which is, he doesn't give credit. Yeah, he doesn't give credit to somebody that got him there, this is the kind of guy he is. And then the federal budget deficit is also another nice one for us to use, is that the budget deficit is up about 60% versus where it would have been if Trump had followed Obama policies. Now, here are the claims, the specific claims that Trump made during the State of the Union address. Years of economic decay are over because he reversed the failed economic policies of the previous administration. So the fact checker here is PolitiFact, and you can see their counter to that, that's just saying this is a ridiculous assertion from Trump. Okay? So when Trump says something, that you can say to him, that's a ridiculous assertion, you started on third base. Okay? I've made an ironclad pledge to American families. We will also protect patients with pre-existing conditions. A flat-out lie. He's doing everything in his power to take that away. Our military is completely rebuilt. I didn't know our military was destroyed by fighting with the Iraqis and the Afghanis, but apparently he did. So I love the fact checker. This hasn't happened. So this is. There's some great State of the Union fact checks. You've got to keep them handy because you're going to have so many good bullet points in there. That's where all this comes from. Thanks to our regulatory reduction campaign, we're the #1 producer of oil and gas. Well, we were already that before Trump came in. And deregulation at this stage, because the U.S. is already so deregulated compared to, say, 20 years ago, deregulation at this stage is not really going to make much difference. So, in fact, it could hurt you go the other way. America has gained, and you brought this up, Bill, America has gained 12,000 new factories under my administration. Well, what he doesn't say is that the number of factories has been growing since 2013. Okay? And also the manufacturing job creation in 2019 was crappy. All right? Trump says he enacted historic and record-setting tax cuts. They weren't anywhere near the largest tax cuts we've had. After decades of flat and falling incomes, wages are rising fast. We talked about wages, and they were going up faster under Obama in real terms. He's talking about nominal. Maybe it's true nominal. Who cares? The real wages are what matter. So, you've got some ammunition here you can use. There are also a couple of really interesting articles that factcheck.org does. Obama by the numbers and Trump by the numbers. Obama has a final number one, his is final, but then Trump, they keep updating it every quarter or so. Obama by the numbers, Trump by the numbers from factcheck.org. You'll always have a lot of this data handy. And you can link it to somebody online very easy. And then this chart I've just updated. This kind of summarizes some of the key arguments that you can make with when you're arguing with a Republican. And it just shows it compares Obama versus Trump. So you got the job creation, you got the unemployment rate trend, you got the federal budget deficit, the uninsured, stock market return, which was actually better under Obama and Clinton at this point in their presidency. So a lot of people hang their head on the stock market. I see it all the time online. Look at that stock market. Well, it's like, yeah, I just wish it were as good as Obama and Clinton is what I always tell people. They're like, what? Then I give them this. And then the real wage growth. So this is a nice one-pager you can share very easily. Get it out there, get it to your friends, tell them to share it, get the word out. Yep.
Does that job creation does that take into account the 501,000?
Yes, that's the latest number. This is the latest.
So they rolled that in now?
It's in there now, yeah. It's a 1.5 million difference. 8.1 versus 6.6. All right. Cool, that's all I got.
That's, wait, what percentage is that?
1.5 out of,
Is that 25?
it's 20-something%, yeah.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. Trump is an expert salesman. Don't ever count him out for his ability to sell. I'm serious, he is. He really is good at it. And this is where the Democrats have to have a counter or even have a better argument. And that's part of what we got to talk about too at some point is, maybe we'll do this over our pizza, is we don't have to just challenge, just argue against Trump. He'll say something ridiculous, we counter. We want to get more people covered with health care. Trump's done nothing. He's gone the other way. We want to get healthcare costs down. He just vetoed the bill that HR 3, I didn't veto it, he's pledged to veto the HR 3, which is the big Medicare bargaining bill. The deficit has gone through the roof. So the Democrats, if they want to get in front of these issues, they should. Now, if Democrats don't want to touch the deficit, they think that they don't want to deal with that, then okay, then make that call. But the other one we've talked about before is the big ticket items. What are you going to do to get healthcare costs down? What are you going to do to get child care costs down? There are 4, rent, and then what's the last one? College, healthcare, rent, and child care. What are you going to do? Because Trump has no plan really for any of those. He's done very little. That's where the Democrats can get in front of it and not just be constantly reacting to Trump. They should, I mean, honestly, you could, as a debater, you could be up there to say, listen, Trump's not a credible source of information. He's lied 16,000 times. That's not a random number, that's a real number. And he also has, the Washington Post keeps track of all his lies. And you can go to any fact-checking site and they have him, he's been the liar of the year 3 years of like the last 5 or 6. He has had the lie of the year. And one of them was his I think his campaign was the lie of the year because they kept lying so much. So why are you voting or even thinking about voting for a president who's not in the least bit credible? Nobody else in the world can trust the guy. I mean, we've got to get back to that kind of offense instead of always on defense all the time. And then sell our agenda. So it's not an easy thing. You're up against a pretty smart guy, and Trump, as embarrassing as it is, the guy is not stupid. And he knows his audience. So, yeah.
The one thing that I'm noticing, particularly on the blogs that I argue on, is a year ago I'd post a factcheck.com or a PolitiFact, to point out something. And this year now I've noticed people coming back with a fact check is biased. PolitiFact that's just a Democratic arm. You can't believe that stuff. I mean, you can't believe CNN, you can't believe, Washington Post or any, now you can't believe the fact checkers. And that insulates them in this world where, it's kind of like, sometimes I just go, Jesus,
If someone is not willing,
God said so.
if someone is not willing to include fact in their reasoning process, then there's no reasoning with them, right? I mean, when you take a logic class, an argument is you make a series of premises, which are usually factual, and then you make a conclusion. The Congressional Budget Office said that the Trump tax cuts will add $2 trillion to the debt, and therefore, that's what your premise, and then your conclusion or your claim is tax cuts increase deficits. That isn't a big leap from the Congressional Budget Office study to this. But if someone says, I don't believe what the Congressional Budget Office says, so therefore I won't agree with your conclusion, you've brought the best information available to the table, and they won't use the same facts, then you can't have a debate with them. There's no reasoning with people like that. It's not a debate. That's not a debate. Yeah.
It was probably 15 to 20 years ago, but I had a conversation with the person in charge of the curriculum for District 211. Okay. And I asked him if they had any classes in critical thinking or rational thought. And the guy paused, and I don't think he was thinking about his answer, but he looks at me and says, I don't know if we have anyone qualified to teach that.
Good for him.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm thinking, the whole freaking district, you don't think you have anybody qualified to teach that?
If someone is not willing to look at a fact, then there's no reasoning with them. And if they think that,
Well, there
that
isn't
you're
going to
the
be any
problem,
reasoning because we don't teach reasoning.
well, come on.
Well,
I mean, my understanding, no, seriously, my understanding is that in the Renaissance, if you were lucky enough to get an education, you got 3 years of it. 3 friggin' years. Okay, of course, then it was nobility and wealthy were the only people who got an education, but you wanted your rulers to make rational decisions. In the United States, who's supposed to be the rulers? People, right? The populace? Don't we want them to make rational decisions? I wonder sometimes.
I'm not sure I see it, that's for sure. But yeah, your frustration is a good one, is that if you run into someone that's not willing to consider a fact, then you're not in a debate, so you don't have to.
But look,
really
if you
engage them.
didn't teach addition to kids, would you be surprised when they grew up if they couldn't do multiplication?
Yeah.
Before we close down tonight, I wonder if Christine could